Next song will be 788. We'll sing the first, second, and fourth verse, 788. Is going to be 707. And if you're able to stand, please stand. Let's sing 452. We'll sing the first and third verse all in unison, and then we'll repeat the first and third verse with the ladies doing the echoes. So first and third verse all in unison. See ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you, singing Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Man shall not live by
Be seated. If you'll take out your copy of God's Word, go to Mark chapter 2. Mark, the second chapter, that's the second book of our New Testament. It's the second gospel account written by Mark, whom we call John Mark. That's chapter 2. We'll begin reading from the end of that chapter in just a moment. We'll read in 23. So thankful you're here. If you're a guest, we are especially thankful. You've chosen to be here. We'd love to get to know you in any way that we can and serve you in any way that we can. And would love to serve you and to get to know you. And just thank you for choosing to worship this day with us. If you're looking for a church home, then we would love to say that you found it. We'd love to talk with you about the Lord's church and the church here at Parish and talk with you about that. Remember, tonight is our singing service at 5 p.m. I always love to sing together, and the building sounds great, and you as singers sound great, and so look forward to assembling tonight. Try to fit in the center section and spend our service singing together. And so, gentlemen, pick out a song to lead. Ladies, maybe pressure your husband or son or whomever to lead that song, or get that request to Mike or myself, and we'd love to lead as many of those as we can tonight. So be planning for that. Always a special time each month, and look forward to that tonight. People you see on the screen are inhabitants. They're natives of an Indian island called Gora'ama. And this is an island that's kind of gained some publicity recently, especially from those who are big supporters of global warming and man-made climate change, those kinds of things. What's fascinating about it is that this is an island off the coast of India in the delta area of the Bay of Bengal, and it is shrinking. The island is shrinking. It used to cover an area of about 8,800 acres, and now it covers about 2,000 acres. So you can see the dramatic shrink, the dramatic loss that they've experienced of their land. And because they're really kind of so native, they really don't know how many residents have fled or died because of this. They know that about 5,000 people live there now. But they're kind of in a difficult situation. Do they decide to move? Do they decide to try to fix the island somehow? How do they respond? How do they answer this dilemma that's started to happen over the past several decades? And you can imagine all the difficulties that would present, because not only is it affecting their living space where their houses are, but it's affecting the land where they grow their crops, the land where they keep their livestock and their animals. So as the island shrinks, they're becoming more and more inconvenienced, and it's really becoming a difficult situation. See, we can anticipate, we can see how scary of a situation that would be, because we all recognize a truth that there is uncertainty, there is even a little fear when we live on the edge. When we choose to live on the edge, and when things are kind of crumbling around us, that suddenly introduces some fears, some uncertainties, and suddenly we begin to experience a lot of stress. You know that feeling if you've had that one little incident that's small. It's not a problem. It's really not that big of a deal. But it's small and kind of doesn't go your way, and you suddenly kind of flip out and go off on the wife and the kids, or you kick the dog, as they say. And it was a little bitty thing. It was a little bitty thing that crossed your path that didn't go your way. The refrigerator door didn't close right, or you dropped something out of the fridge and it broke and busted, and suddenly you just blow up. Because what do we say? It pushed us over the edge. That's why we can't live on the edge, right? Maybe you get toward the end of the month and you've got your checkbook balanced. You've got it, we've got a little bit of money left. Whew. Made it. We can make it till payday. And then your husband finds a receipt that he had forgotten to give you, and it's just a few cents more than that balance was in your checkbook. And suddenly there are overdraft fees and all this other kind of stuff because you were living on the edge, and it was a small thing. It pushed you over the edge. That's why we can't live on the edge. It's one thing to live on the edge, if you will, in kind of the practical areas of life. In traffic, we get caught in traffic jams, we run behind. That's a scary kind of picture if you're so disposed, afraid of heights, those kinds of things. It's one thing to live on the edge kind of physically and just in those ways. But it's another thing altogether when we talk about how living on the edge affects us spiritually. That's because God never designed for us to live in this life so that we have no margin, we have no resources, we have no time to give to Him. And so when we choose to live on the edge, we sacrifice opportunities to serve Him. See, what happens is kind of a process. You may notice if you kind of look back, it's hard to tell if you're in it. It's really easy to tell in the lives of other people. But if you look back in your own life, you might can see it. Margin shrinks, and then suddenly we get a little stressed out, we get a little claustrophobic, and then that causes our focus to narrow. We suddenly turn into survival mode, and so we focus on ourselves. And then that automatically is going to cause relationships to suffer because we fall into this unintentional, unintended trap of selfishness because we've pushed all the margin out of our lives, and suddenly it brings on this stress, and that causes relationships to suffer. And so when God designed us, when God has given us this life to live, He's not designed us to use everything in our lives just on how we choose and then not have any left for enjoyment, not have any left for Him. He's not designed for us to live on the edge. So this morning we're going to go back to the Old Testament and see a principle behind a major part of the life of the Israelites to try to highlight how important it is for us today to still live with margin so we can serve Him. We'll set up the next few weeks and even some lessons over the course of the next rest of the year, in fact, some things we'll do with this. Just think about the role that margin plays. Healthy margin, good margins. Pages of books have margins. If you're using a physical Bible, you'll notice none of your words go to the very edge. Okay, it kind of freaks us out to look at a page that has no margins. We need margins to give us some breathing room, give our eyes some breathing room. The two closets there, you can see visually, one has margin, one does not have margin. Okay, which is easier to find something in? Clearly the one that has that margin, right? It's a lot more stressful when you're kind of running late, got to make a choice, and you go to that closet that's messy to try to have to find something. It's not enjoyable because it increases that stress. Think about all the margins that happen on the roadways. You have shoulders, a little bit of room around the cars. You imagine how nervous it would be if we go out to the corridor and there's 2 or 3 lanes, but every lane is as tight as the car is. There's no room around the car in the lane. You ever thought about the connection between the speed limit and the size of the road? See a road like that one on the screen? What's that, 15, 25 mile an hour speed limit probably? We get a big, wide open road, straight away, several lanes, and we can jump that up to 70, right? Because we have more margin, more safety, more space, we can be a little more efficient. When you think about how you pack, no matter if you live with margin or not, we probably pack with margin. Okay? You ever carry just enough outfits to make it? Or do you always throw in a few extra? A few extra shirts, a few extra pants, a few extra pairs of socks, undergarments perhaps, right? We do that. We're a little paranoid. I don't want to run out. Can't run out of that, so I'm going to throw in a few extra. No matter how you live, you probably pack with margin. There are certain people who also, when they pack every possible medicine or first aid need that they might need, first aid solution they might need. So it's a walking pharmacy when you go on a trip. And that's not bad. That's what we call margin. In case something happens, I want to be prepared, right? I'm going to carry extra so that we can kind of be prepared for the moments that we're not prepared for. If we see the value of margin, just practically speaking, all these areas of life that we really don't think about, I think that should highlight to us how useful it is and how God has designed this world so that we have that breathing room, so that we have that safety net, so we have that margin to live with. And so if God has designed us that way, then it's important that we see that living with that margin is the best way for us to know Him and to obey Him. So let's go to Mark 2. Mark 2, verse 23. We're going to go to the Old Testament, but we're going to start in the New Testament to see a principle that Jesus talks about. Mark 2, verse 23. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him?" And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So quickly, our goal is not to really break down everything Jesus told them. But just so that we're clear, Jesus is not endorsing situational ethics. He's not saying, listen, David was hungry. It was okay for him to eat the bread, so it's okay for my guys to eat the grain. First of all, they were upset because his guys, Jesus' disciples, broke one of their traditions. Okay, it wasn't unlawful under the law for them to pluck that head of grain as they walked by, but they had made it a law. So first of all, he's kind of putting them on the spot for that. But second, Jesus is not endorsing David's decision. Jesus is getting back at them for them playing favorites. See, they love David. But Jesus said he broke the law when he did that. And you still honor him. You still hold him high and holy as your once great king. But here I am, and I've not broken a law, and you're trying to convict me and kill me eventually. And here you are honoring David, who clearly broke the law. So he's highlighting that hypocrisy in their lives. But then he goes one step further in that last statement where he says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And he says, because I am the Son of Man, I am the Lord, the Master, the God of the Sabbath. He says, you honor and you sanctify and you even bind your own traditions regarding this day, this Sabbath day, but you've forgotten the God who gave it to you. You hold up this Sabbath day, but you've forgotten that God gave it to you, and you've forgotten him who gave it to you. And so it brings up an interesting point. If Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, why? We ask that question. Why did God give the children of Israel, his people, a day to set aside, to sanctify for him? Why did God do that? And so as quickly as we can, we'll go back to the Old Testament, to the book of Exodus, and then to the book of Deuteronomy, and try our best to see the principles at play behind the Sabbath day, okay? And as we do that, quick just disclaimer, so that we're on the same page. We don't live by the Sabbath today, okay? We don't keep it. We don't enforce it. It's clear the Sabbath is mentioned a lot in the New Testament. And the majority of the times, it's Jesus proving that there's something new coming. It's Jesus proving that the law is ended. It will end upon the cross. It's nailed to the cross, Colossians 2. And as much as it's mentioned, it's never repeated in terms of the Ten Commandments or anything like that. It's never repeated that it's something for Christians to do. And so when we talk about it, we're setting up a principle that God put into play, but the specific way the principle plays out is different for us as Christians than it was for the Israelites, okay? Clearly, Sunday is the Lord's day for the Christian, and the day itself is not what's holy, but rather we choose to worship him on that day. And so what we do in worship is what's holy, okay? So just so that we're clear on that, let's go to Exodus 16. This is the first time you find the word Sabbath. This is when it was instituted for the Israelites, okay? So you have these millions of people who've been led out of the wilderness, across the Red Sea. Moses has led them out, and they now have to find a way to live. They have to eat, they have to sleep, they have to drink, they have to do all these things. And so God tells them, I'm going to provide every single day. You're going to wake up and you're going to have manna and you're going to have quail. I'm going to give you your carbs and I'm going to give you your protein every single day. And you gather enough every single day for that day. If you gather extra when you wake up in the morning, it's going to spoil. It's going to go bad. So this will come back to play, but he's building in that level of trust. Only get what you need for today. He says you're going to do that for 6 days. On the 6th day, though, you need to gather up extra because the next day is special. The next day is different. So gather up double on day 6, prepare everything on day 6, getting ready for day 7. So let's look at Exodus 16, verse 22, to see about that extra day. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of, catch it, solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till morning. So they laid it aside till the morning. Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. So you see the simplicity of it. But Moses says, this day is to the Lord. You prepare. You look ahead. This day is to the Lord. A day for you to rest to the Lord. Flip over to Exodus 20. This is the Ten Commandments. Okay? It's interesting that one of the longest paragraphs on the Ten Commandments is about this day. Okay? Verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. 4, he's already said it's to the Lord. Now notice the new element he's giving us in verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So God gives them this command to keep this seventh day holy. Don't work, don't cook, don't clean. You rest. You keep this day holy to the Lord. And he does so in pointing back to creation and saying, look, God worked, if you will, on 6 days. He made all the world, all that's in it within 6 days. Then he rested on day 7, giving you an example, giving you a reason to take off that seventh day. Exodus 31, verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you, throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. So he adds a little bit more to the discussion here. It's a sign, and you shall know, it will remind you that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Pretty serious charges there, right? Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall the work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. On the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So you have the idea, once again, pointing back to creation, but you also have a little bit of different language here. It's a sign, and it's a sign of the covenant. So the idea of a covenant is it's a contract, it's a binding agreement, but it also has that level of relationship involved in it. See, our modern day cultural marriages is a form of a covenant. It's a contract. We've agreed to be married, but we also are emotionally bound to one another. We've committed to one another on an emotional relationship level. And that's what he's saying. This is a sign of the covenant between me and you. You're my people. And so this day is a sign of that relationship. One more passage, Deuteronomy 5, verse 12. This is Moses repeating the law of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, the law, before they go in the second time, before the second generation, the second wave goes into the promised land. Deuteronomy 5, verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant, your female servant, your ox, your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who's within your gates, that your male servant and female servant may rest as well as you. Here's the reason, verse 15, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So again, you have that element, remember. And he specifies, remember, there was a time you were a slave in Egypt. Yes, you're wandering in the wilderness, and yes, you're wondering yourself, am I going to make it to the promised land? But remember, every time this day comes around, you remember you were a slave and God delivered you. If we summarize all four of those passages, God gave the Sabbath as a sign of his relationship with the Israelites. Every time Saturday comes, you remember I'm your God. You remember that I am your God and you are my people. We do this today, do we not? An anniversary is a day to remember the relationship. A birthday is a day to remember a special event. If I wake up on May 20th and I don't ever say happy anniversary, if I don't ever say I'm so glad that I married you to Amanda, I'm in trouble any year. I'm really in trouble this year because it'll be 10, Lord willing. And so, we do that. Anniversaries are special because it reminds us of that relationship. It's a sign of our relationship. He says, this day, every day you get there, every day you remember it, you remember me. You don't work, you don't clean, you don't cook, you stay in, you and your family, your workers, and you remember me. You remember what I've done for you, how I've delivered you, how I've provided for you these other 6 days. So pause to remember me. It's a relationship. But there's an extra level of this, layer of this. I haven't really thought about this a lot. But consider the measure of trust that he's building, okay? He legislates, commands the Israelites to have margin. If they ignore the Sabbath, they're killed, they're executed. He commands them to have margin in their lives so that they would learn to trust him. If you know much about the Israelites and their laws, when God gives them, this is not the only way in which they were commanded to have margin. Their land was supposed to have margin, meaning they could work the land for 6 years in a row. But then in the 7th year, they had to let it lie fallow, is what we say. You can't touch it. You have to let it heal. So what happens? That 7th year, you have to decide, I'm going to trust God. He told them to prepare. You know it's coming. But you imagine being told that? You cannot grow food for an entire year on this land. That means you have to trust God. You cannot work on this 7th day. That means you have to trust God. You know, too, about their contributions, how they would tithe, okay? They would give 10% of the temple for the well-being of the Levites. They would have to give to the poor, the needy, have to give in other ways, 20, 30, or more percent. They had to give out of what they were given, out of their money that they sold their crops for, out of their crops themselves. And so you can see how they would say, God, you mean we've got to live on 70% of what you give us? We have to live on 80% of what you give us? How's that possible? God says you trust me. I know you can live on 100%, but I don't want you to live on the edge because I want you to trust me. Remember what we said, that practical aspect of margin? When we lose margin, it leads us to get stressed. It leads us to lose focus or to focus mostly on ourselves, which causes relationships to suffer. So here God programs. He legislates to have margin so that they will remember him and trust him and build the relationship with him as their God. Think about how much of a culture shock this would have been to the Israelites. They've lived for generations in Egypt. And as slaves, did they get Saturday off? They get Sunday off. They work 5 days a week, 8 to 5. They were worked hard, sun up to sundown. They took a day off, they probably got executed. Or they got worked double hard the next day or the next week. Who knows what would happen to them? They were slave labor in the land of Egypt. Then they're set free, and they have to wonder, how am I going to live? How are we going to live? Can we grow enough? How can we sustain all these people? And God says, you trust in me. That's why I'm giving you margin. That's why you live on 6 days instead of 7. That's why you live on 70 to 80% of your income. That's why you live on your land at certain seasons and in certain years. So that you'll remember, all this comes from me. You'll put your trust in me. So why would we talk about this? Why would we choose to talk about margin and the importance of margin? Just quickly. First reason, as a preacher, I've been told one of the best things we can do as preachers is to preach from your weaknesses because you'll never run out of material. And what that means is if you think you struggle with this, there's a good chance I struggle with it just as much as you do, maybe worse. Okay? I'm not great at margin. If I've got it, I'll fill it up. If I have a minute, I'll take 2. Okay? I'm great at procrastinating. I mean, I'm right there with you, okay? So if this does not apply to you as much, that's okay. I'm in the depths. I need to live with margin. But another reason is we also live in a culture that promotes and celebrates excess. You know, you think about that idea of living off of 70 to 80% of income. How is it celebrated today? You don't even have to live off 100% of your income. You can live off 120% of your income, 130% of your income. See, that's our culture. And God's not designed us to live that way. God's not designed for us to take in as much as we can and fill our lives full of everything we want and live on the edge. He's rather designed us to pull back, to say no, and to live with margin and in the margins so that our relationship with Him and the relationships we have in this life are enjoyable and productive and fruitful in our lives. So if you are here and you do have margin in terms of your time and your schedule, in terms of your finances, in terms of your people skills and your relationships, then we celebrate that. We thank you for that. Typically, you can look at this kind of generationally, and older generations live with more margin than people my age. I mean, that's just typical. You look at it cross-section wise. And so if you sit back and you say, well, I feel pretty rested normally. I enjoy my life. I enjoy my family. I'm comfortable financially. And that's great. We need to learn. I need to learn from people like you. But this is also a time that all of us can reflect and say, when I do have margin, how am I using it? Who am I using it for? And so to set this up, this is part one of a multi-part series, if you will. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about time. How do we develop margin in terms of our time? And then we're going to take a few months off so that we get kind of the hang of putting some of those things into place in terms of our time. And then we're going to look at relationships and how can we build margin in terms of how we relate to one another and how we use the people skills, the personalities that God gives us. And we'll take a few more months off to try to put some of those things into practice. And then toward the end of the year, we'll talk about margin in terms of our finances. How does God intend for us to leverage margin in our money toward His glory and for His purposes? Okay? So that gives us a little bit of a heads up. So that means to kind of wrap this up this morning and look at this practically for us. Why do we need margin? Margin is going to be how we best and most enjoy this life. God doesn't intend for one little bitty thing to set us off and us get mad and angry at the people we love. He doesn't intend for us to live that way. He doesn't intend for one missed transaction to send our finances into a tailspin. He doesn't intend for us to live that way. He wants us to enjoy the people He puts in our lives. He wants us to enjoy His relationship. And sometimes living on the edge is fun, but it's rarely enjoyable over the long haul. And so if we want to really enjoy the life He gives us, then we exercise some margin, use that margin for Him. And that's really where this ultimately comes to. Having margin, intentionally having margin is going to be how we best serve Him and others. See, we've tried to really emphasize that connection between margin and relationships, because it's in that margin that relationships are built. When you dated your spouse or you courted your spouse, that was a time where you spent time with them to decide if you were going to marry them. That was margin you built into your relationship, and that caused the relationship. Or that revealed about someone else potentially not going to build a relationship there. So that margin was helpful to you. So if it's so important to relationships, you can see how it's so important to our relationship with God. And so that's our purpose in this series, this lesson this morning, in the next few weeks, and on through the year as we come back to it. If we've sacrificed all the margin in our lives, it's going to hurt our relationship with God. I want to do a quick rewind to some things we've talked about over the past few months. Matthew 22, verses 30. Did I put those up there? No. Matthew 22, 2 through 40, 37 through 40. Jesus says, here are the two commandments, whole law. Everything hangs on. Love God, love your neighbor. You remember toward the beginning of the year, we talked from Matthew 25 about that idea of loving your neighbor. That God gives us, the parable of talents, Matthew 25, beginning of verse 14, God gives us all talents, opportunities, blessings. He gives us margin. Go back and reread that parable this afternoon or tonight. That's Him giving us margin. And he's going to judge us how we leverage that margin. How do we use that? But also think about the 1 talent guy. He feared his master, so he buried the talent. If he feared his master, that means he did not trust him. He was scared. If I do something with this talent, with this piece of money, and I lose it, goodness, I don't know what he'll have me killed. He'll have me sent off. He didn't trust his master. And so in order for us to live with margin, just as it was the Israelites, we have to choose to trust God. If we're going to serve him, we're going to live for him, we're going to love our neighbors, it means we trust in him. Further in that chapter, Matthew 25, what separated the goats and the sheep? It was how they served other people. Did it say the sheep made more money than the goats? No. All it said was they were the ones who fed the hungry. They were the ones who clothed the needy. They were the ones who housed the homeless, the lonely. They were the ones who visited the sick. And so if we're going to best serve our neighbor the way God commands us to serve and to love our neighbor, it means we have margin and then we leverage it for their benefit. So they didn't make more than the goats, but rather they had more to give. They made sure to give it to them. Our culture around us gets this backwards. See, so many people in this world live without any margin. No time, they spend it all themselves, spend all their time on themselves, their family, all their money on themselves, their family. No margin whatsoever. But it's for the purpose of impressing other people, keeping up with certain people. But yet God says, you take the things I give you and you use them for other people because you decide to love them and you decide to follow me. So if we're going to love our neighbor the way God commanded us to, that means we're going to have margin and use that margin to serve him. Think back to Matthew 28, one of the first series we talked about when Amanda and I began here with you, the Great Commission. Imagine these Jewish people who've lived with all this margin, okay, as Israelites. And Jesus says, go make disciples of every nation. Here they are, they've set aside, they give, they're generous. But can you see their wheels turning? How they could say, every nation? How can we afford that? How can we have the time to go make disciples? How can we welcome people who are our enemies right now if we're supposed to go to all nations? So you see how that would have really given them a jolt. Here they were living with margin, but yet his command to make disciples of all nations still would have challenged them, and it still challenges us today. How are we going to save the lost? It's going to take time. How are we going to make disciples? It's going to take money. How are we going to reach people in the depths of their sin, the depths of their poor decisions? It's going to take patience. How are we going to reach people who are our enemies? It's going to take continuing to develop those people skills, continuing to develop the love for one another that God teaches us to have. And that's how we love God, to carry out his will. There from Matthew 28. See, think about this. Does God really intend? If you're God, okay, put yourself in God's shoes the best we can. And he fast forwards, he looks forward to this day and this country that's still the greatest country on the face of the earth. Does he sit there and think, well, you know, if I can get those Americans to give me 4 hours a week and 10% of their paycheck, then we can save this whole world. Was that God's plan? Did the first century church, did they turn the world upside down by saying, hey, I know we're busy, I know we're kind of persecuted some, but if you can just do 4 hours a week and 10% of our money, then I think we can turn this whole world upside down. Was that their plan? No. I'm not being negative about that, okay? But let's just try to be realistic. Does God intend for us to use a small sliver of what he gives us to do his will, or does he have something greater in mind for us? Now, I say that not to be negative, but to set us up for this, knowing that if you're here this morning, there's a really good chance that you want to do more. Your desire is to be more and to do more for God. And so this lesson isn't to step on your toes. Like I said, I'm right there with you. It's not to hit you over the head with the Bible or anything like that. It's to challenge us because we all want to do more. But we all say, if I had more time, I would do what? If I had more money, I would do this. If I had better people skills, I would do this. If I didn't jump out in anger and lash out in anger so quickly, I could do this. We say those things, and yet God's in the background telling us, I've designed you to live with margin. If you would live life the way I've designed you, you would have the time. You would have the money. You would have the relationships you need. And so if there are things in your life that you sit there and you think, I'd love to read through the Bible in a year, but I just don't have the time. I'd love to study more. I don't have the time. I'd love to be more generous to those missionaries when they come through or when the elders tell us about a need. I'd love to give more outside of worship. I'd love to be able to give a little money to somebody who's in need, but I just don't have the money. I'd love to come to Bible class more often, but I don't have the time and the energy. See, if you catch yourself saying that, that's a red flag. That's an alarm going off to say, I need to say no to some things so that I can have more margin to then leverage it for God, to then use it for His glory. So, as we say all this, don't get the picture that I'm being negative, because our goal is to start where we're at, to make progress, steps, daily and weekly, then use it for good. See, trusting, we've highlighted this idea of trust. Saying no is scary. It involves us trusting in God because we feel like we may miss out. Our life may not matter if we start saying no to some opportunities. But what often happens in our culture especially is we say yes to so many good things that the things that really do matter are what suffers. We're doing a lot of good things. But the things that matter, the best things, are what ends up suffering. And you see that, unfortunately, a lot of times in the lives of people who fall away. People who no longer are connected to the Lord and His church. A lot of times, no matter the sin they're involved in now, no matter the relationships now, no matter the complexities of the situation, a lot of times, the very first piece of the puzzle was, I got busy, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and then I fell away. Because margin is where we build relationships. And if we fail to make time for God, if we fail to make time for His church and each other, then that sacrifices our relationships, the opportunity to have those relationships. So let's close with 1 Timothy 6. What we'll do is we're going to substitute a word to see these principles. Paul's writing to Timothy, his preacher, telling him what to instruct them to do there in Ephesus. And this is a passage that's largely about money. So when we get to talking about money at the end of the year, we'll come back to this passage. But for our purposes this morning, let's just use the word extra, okay? If margin is kind of the extra, it's the seventh day, it's the little bit on the edges, okay? Think about that. So 1 Timothy 6, verse 17. As for those with extra in the present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of the extra, but on God, who richly provides us with everything, notice, to enjoy. They're to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Did you catch that? First, Paul says, those who have extra, those who have great riches, teach them not to rely on those riches, but the one who gives the riches. So if we're going to live a life on margin, it's not just to serve self, but it's to remember God who's given us those things. Remember the problem the Pharisees had? They elevated the Sabbath day and forgot the God who gave them the Sabbath day. That's exactly what Paul says to avoid. For people who are blessed immensely in this age, teach them to do something with it, but don't put their hope in it, but rather the one who gave it to them. So if we're going to live with margin, we recognize this comes from God, and I'm going to trust and hope in Him because He's given it to us. And you see how I highlighted it, but you see again, He gave us everything to enjoy. God's not against us enjoying life. There's no joy in living without margin and living on the edge. No joy in those complications that arise. But then second, in this paragraph, do you see how this has eternal implications? By being generous, by being ready to share, loving our neighbor, we store up for ourselves treasure as a good foundation for the future. That's reminiscent of Jesus in Matthew 6, is it not? So that we may take hold of that which is truly life. If we ever buy the lie that this life is what's most important, then we miss out. And he says, everyone who has extra, leverage it for the glory of God in the lives of other people, and that's truly life. Truly life. I said this is kind of personal for me because it's something I struggle with. When we made the move and I had to clean out my office at Midway, I boxed up all my books and everything, and there's less bookshelf space here than I had there, which is not a problem. I've still got room to put it all in. But for a while, in my car, there were 2 empty seats. The seat I drove in, and the seat where Hazel's car seat is. And the rest was full of boxes with books in it. The front seat had a couple of boxes with books. The extra in the back seat was full of books. The extra behind the back seat was full of boxes. It's not all books, but mostly books. And you know what? I noticed 2 or 3 at least people walking down the side of the road, even if it was just this short strip of highway on 269 here between the intersection and the building. During that time that I had my car full of those boxes, I noticed 2 or 3 people walking down the side of the road. And I said, you know what? If I had more space, I could give them a ride. But because my car was full, I didn't have the room to help that person out. So I have to create margin in order to be able to make a difference, in order to be able to serve God the way He wants me to serve Him. I've made a little progress, okay? No books in the front seat, none really in the back seat. My car's still a mess, but created a little margin. This morning, if God's missing out because your life's full, then let's be honest with ourselves. Let's let today be the day that you start looking and start figuring out, where can I say no? What can I cut out? What difficult decisions do I have to make? This is something that's going to take a while. We can't just leave here and say, oh, that was a great idea. Let's live with margin, and poof, we have margin. It's going to be tough. That's why we're going to try to spread it out. That's why we're going to look at some things individually. But let's do this. So let's commit to living a life God's designed us to live, which means we have margin so that we can serve Him and build that relationship with Him, and so that we can serve the people He puts in our lives so that we can serve them. This morning, you've been given a wonderful opportunity, just a few minutes of an invitation song, and you can decide how to use that time if you need to for Him. If you need to become a Christian through the baptism for forgiveness of your sins, we beg for you to use this time for that purpose. You need to come back to Him and repent of your sins. We beg of you to do that this morning as well. If you have any need whatsoever, please come as we stand and sing together. God.